Hey folks, it's Nate. It's time I got back to the drawing board, and tonight, another installment on crafting conflict. This is part 3 of 4, and tonight we're going to talk about techniques and power, part of the 4 steps to victory, specifically the second 2 of said 4 steps. If you want to go back and listen to the first 2, which are strategy and tactics, I've linked that video down in the description below. A quick recap, if it's been a while since you've listened to that one, or if you just want to dive into this and then go back and listen to the other one later, the 4 steps to victory are how I kind of think about the conflict in a story as I'm putting it together. And everyone has them, both protagonists and antagonists, and they define how the characters are going to go about trying to come out on top of whatever situation they're in. So, as I said before, a strategy is broadly what you want to do, and tactics are how you go about doing it. This is important because the third step, techniques, are what you do when you run into opposition. So if, for example, to go with a example I started a little bit on in my last video, if Miss Adrian Monk is a detective, and his goal, his strategy, is going to be to solve a mystery within certain confines. Generally for Adrian Monk, that means without getting himself dirty, without breaking any laws, because he's extremely OCD. He doesn't like to break laws. His technique, or his tactics, are to use his power of observation and his excellent memory to put together patterns that allow him to unravel the mystery of what happened. So if those are his strategy and his tactics, what are his techniques? Well, his techniques are manifold. He conducts interrogations. He relies on his assistant Natalie for help, or he had another assistant, Sharona, that's it. He relies on his assistant Sharona or Natalie for help, depending on where you are in the story. And he draws on old contacts that he has in the police force whenever he runs into opposition. Of course, he has his own formidable reputation, which often gives him leeway with people like the mayor or the chief of police, as opposed to the police captain and police lieutenant who he typically interacts with. So those are some of the techniques that Monk uses when he runs into problems. But that's not really as interesting from the perspective of telling a story with conflict. So to give some examples of techniques in stories of conflict, I want to look at the manga that is called Hajime no Ippo. And I can't remember what the English title is off the top of my head. I read this back in the Wild West days when a lot of stuff you read had to be fan translated because it wasn't licensed. I know you can find the anime adaptation of a large chunk of this series, I believe on Crunchyroll, maybe on Funimation, one of those two. Anyway, Ippo is a series about boxing. Boxing is a very popular subject for action anime and action manga. Has been pretty much since the classic Ashita no Joe. But Ippo is, it's a different story. And there are there's a lot of examples of characters in that series using techniques to allow their tactics to overcome their opponent's tactics. I'm just going to look at 2. The first example is in Sendo versus Ippo, I believe round 3. It's been a while since I read this. It could be round 2. Long story short, in boxing, there are 3 generally acknowledged styles of boxing. There's technical boxing, or outboxing, as it's frequently called in Ippo, in which the boxer kind of keeps their distance and uses jabs to keep the opponent at a distance, and kind of wins through points or wears their opponent down and throws a couple of counter punches, turning their opponent's own offense against them. There are fighters, people who get in and just hammer their opponent with a bunch of heavy hits. And then there are swarmers who produce a lot of hits very quickly. And it's generally understood that technical boxers beat fighters, fighters beat swarmers, and swarmers beat technical boxers. I mean, it's not that clear cut, but that's the general wisdom. A bit like the weapons triangle, if you're familiar with Fire Emblem. Some weapons are better against other weapons, except when they're not. Anyways, the interesting thing about Ippo versus Sendo is that both of those people are fighters. They use the same tactics. They try and get in close and hit with some really powerful punches, and they put a lot of momentum behind it, and that's just how they fight. So when Ippo and Sendo meet in this fight, they fought each other before. They know a fair bit about each other, and Ippo also has a very dangerous technique called the Dempsey roll. The Dempsey roll is an incredibly powerful series of punches which allow him to win by forcing his opponent backwards and building up a huge amount of momentum. The problem with this is that Sendo is a fighter just like Ippo is. He also pushes forward using his own momentum against his opponent. So it's very difficult for Ippo to use the Dempsey roll because he can't build up the momentum he needs to make the technique work. And that happens because he and Sendo are both using the same tactics. And this eventually boils down to Ippo adding more techniques. He uses a liver blow and an uppercut to break up Sendo's momentum and allow him to build up the forward momentum he needs to use the Dempsey roll. So he's used in order to use his tactics, he had to correctly apply 3 techniques, and he had to do it in very quick succession. This is very impressive, not only visually, because the artist who draws Ippo is an incredible artist and very good at illustrating boxing scenes, probably in part because he himself was a professional boxer for a short time. But it's also impressive because we see how Ippo and Sendo's tactics are stalemated, and how Ippo has the experience and the fighting instincts to turn his available techniques against Sendo in a way that will allow him to come out on top of the situation. So we see the tactics evenly matched, and that builds suspense. And then Ippo applies these techniques, not flawlessly at first. It takes him a couple of tries to break up Sendo's momentum and land his killing combo. That's very interesting. That's very compelling. It's fun to watch because there's a back and forth. There's the moment they realize they're equally matched. There's the moment Ippo realizes Sendo is on guard against the Dempsey roll and has figured out its weakness, that if he can prevent Ippo from getting any momentum going, he wins. Or at least he won't lose to the Dempsey roll, which is not the same as winning, admittedly. So that's a very interesting, a very compelling kind of part of the storytelling. And that's what makes these moments of tactics and techniques very important to conflict-based storytelling. Now, in that case, there was a stalemate reached through tactics, and then Ippo had to come up with a plan on the fly to overcome that stalemate. So that's one way that tactics can be an important part of your conflict. The other way is when your characters go in knowing already that they're at a disadvantage in tactics, but they have to overcome that. And they already have a plan, but the audience doesn't know what the plan is. They find it out as the opposition does. And that's another way to approach this kind of storytelling. And Ippo also has a story where that is a big part. And that story is in the Mashiba versus Kimura fight. This is a title match, and it doesn't have the title character in it. It's a match for the Japanese boxing title in the, I believe, lightweight class is the class they're fighting in. So that's how it's a title match. It's not a title match involving the title character. Anyways, Kimura is a friend of Ippo's, and they are in the same boxing gym, so they've trained together a lot. And Mashiba is a person that Ippo had to box with earlier. They fought before, and he's kind of unscrupulous, but he's an excellent boxer. He's a very dangerous boxer. So there's a lot of stakes going into this fight. But the other thing is that Mashiba is a swarmer. He specializes in throwing out a lot of very, very fast jabs. And he breaks down people's defenses with them. And he follows that up with a single powerful hit. On the other hand, Kimura is a technical boxer. He's very weak against swarmers. He tries to keep his distance and counter hit when the opportunity presents itself. There's never an opportunity to counter hit against Mashiba. His tactics are bad, so he has to come up with a technique that allows him to still win. We see Kimura training his technique quite a bit, but we're never entirely clear on what it is. We only know that it's inspired by his pet fish as he watches it eat a fly that he's feeding it. And that shows us the shape of what he's trying to do, but not what it is he's actually trying to do. And through the whole match with Mashiba, Kimura continues to go for body blows. He just punches Mashiba in the stomach over and over again. It's really brutal. Mashiba has a hard time keeping up with it. And then when Mashiba finally breaks down and he starts guarding against these body blows, Kimura uses his gaze, which is lowered down, towards his torso, to hide the fact that he swings his arm around behind him and just whales him one in the face. He calls it the dragonfish maneuver, and it's really, really impressive to watch him pull it off. And it's a technique that turns that Kimura uses to turn Mashiba's swarming style, where he just throws out a bunch of punches and isn't paying the most attention to where Kimura's hands are, against him and hits him from a blind spot. It's a really impressive use of a technique to overcome a deadlock in tactics, or even a disadvantage in tactics. And while it's impressive, it's also important to note that Kimura still loses the fight. He doesn't quite have what it takes to get through it. But he did come up with a technique that allowed him to overcome the difference in tactics. Now, I said before that usually in a battle of in a conflict, it is the person who has the advantage at the higher step that wins. So you would think that when Mashiba has the advantage in tactics, then Kimura would not be able to beat him with techniques. However, what he did with that technique is he completely changed his boxing style, and he stopped being a technical fighter that was weak to a swarmer, and he became a fighter, somebody who just used one or two really heavy hits to flip things in his favor. and he completely transformed himself in that fight. And that's part of what makes what he did there so impressive, because Kimura is not really a fighter. He doesn't have the build for it. He doesn't have the strength for it. But because he came up with a fighter's technique and added that to his arsenal, he was able to he was able to change tactics in a way that his opponent was not expecting. And that is why he was able to, for a while, look like he was coming out on top in that fight. Now, what ultimately cost him the match was he just didn't have the stamina. And so he had one technique which gave him a little bit of a tactical advantage, but he didn't have it the whole time. It took a lot of setup to get that hit off. He really had to work for it, and he couldn't do it over and over again. And so when it came down to it, he was at a disadvantage for a little while and then at an advantage for a little while. And what balanced it out was power, which is the last step to victory. If you're matched through techniques, if you're matched through tactics, and you're matched in strategy, then ultimately the question is who has the most oomph left, who can hit the hardest, who can go the longest. And interestingly enough, this is where a lot of comics, especially, but many stories in general, show their conflict resolved. And there's nothing really wrong with that. It is kind of interesting to see a lot of exchanges back and forth as tactics adjust and as strategy adjusts and as techniques are brought into play to try and give tactical advantages and all these other things. But a lot of stories allow things to just boil down to power. You can see that in anime and manga, where the one final blow or the beams pushing against each other are common tropes. You can see that a lot in comics, where characters like Superman are assumed they're just going to get through every situation because they're so powerful. And again, there's nothing wrong with that. In moderation. I don't think power should always be the defining element in conflict. And sure, it's better to be faster, it's better to be stronger, it's better to have more stamina. All those things are good. But I don't have a pencil here. I'll be right back. Okay. Yeah, garbage tier. What is this? Anyways, so where was I? Oh, yes. Well, having a resolution based on power is not in and of itself bad. I think it gets kind of boring after a while, and I do prefer these more intricate resolutions. One of my favorite Marvel movies is Doctor Strange, simply because Doctor Strange overcomes Dormammu by using his brain. He out-strategizes him. He uses better tactics than him. He has the technique he needs to win. And that was ultimately a lot more compelling to me than seeing another 15-minute beat-em-up scene. Not that there's anything wrong with those scenes. I enjoy them as much as the next guy. But eventually I like to see something a little different. And that's one thing Doctor Strange brought that a lot of other Marvel movies don't. So as you go about crafting your stories, don't just go for, the big punch-out climax. Again, nothing wrong with that. It's great. I like it in moderation. But also look for opportunities to resolve your stories on the levels of tactics, on the levels of techniques, and even occasionally on the level of strategy. Don't shy away from it. Be very conscious of it. And every now and then, let those stories be sorted out by skill, by trickery, by inventiveness, rather than just by who punches the hardest. and you will get much better stories. Also, think about how your story works across all 4 levels, because even if a story does come down to a power conflict, seeing all that engagement across other levels is a lot of fun. So now that I've looked at all 4 steps to victory, I'm actually going to do a breakdown of a single storyline and how those steps play out across that storyline. And the story I'm going to be looking at is the end of the world, or Dio's world, depending on what translation you get, which is the closing confrontation of the JoJo's Bizarre Adventure arc, Stardust Crusaders. It's going to be full of spoilers, and I'm not going to break down the story in a terribly detailed fashion as I go through it. So if you're interested in what it's like before we dive into that, you can go over to Crunchyroll and watch it there. I highly recommend it just for its own sake. JoJo's Bizarre Adventure is a great show, and I think you would enjoy it regardless. But even if you're not that into anime, if you're planning on watching the next part, I would do that. But I will do my best to make my points clearly and concisely, even if you haven't. Anyway, that's all I got for today. I hope you enjoyed that. If you did, well, there's a like button and subscribe button down below. Use them as you see fit. And I'll talk to you later.